U.S. President Donald Trump says he will now impose a 50% tariff on...
In a moment that echoed the unpredictability and high-stakes brinkmanship of his first term, former U.S. President Donald Trump reignited economic shockwaves by declaring a 50% tariff on copper imports during a cabinet meeting in Washington. The announcement, abrupt and vague in execution timeline, followed a now familiar rhetorical style, listing off previous tariff triumphs like steel, aluminum, and lumber, before bluntly stating, "And now today, we're doing copper." Within 24 hours, the consequences were already unfolding at breakneck speed. Global commodity markets convulsed in response. Copper futures on the COMEX exchange surged by 13% overnight, pushing the price to a record $5.95 per pound. At the heart of this market eruption stood Canada, America's largest copper supplier, responsible for over 40% of refined copper imports. Ottawa responded with swift retaliation. All copper export contracts to the U.S. were frozen, and mining behemoths such as Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals halted shipments. The message from Canadian officials was unambiguous. We can no longer rely on a trade partner that is unstable and unilaterally changes the rules of the game. Copper, a metal often overlooked by the general public but essential to everything from electronics to automobiles to energy infrastructure. As tariffs formally took effect on August 1, 2025, copper prices in U.S. futures markets soared to $5.64 to $5.69 per pound, while London Metal Exchange prices buckled slightly due to fears of declining American demand. This divergence created a rare arbitrage opportunity and underscored what critics describe as the fundamental flaw in the Trump administration's protectionist logic, artificially inflating domestic prices while doing little to address structural weaknesses in supply and production. Canada's reaction was not only swift but strategically calculated. Ottawa committed to breaking its dependence on the American market by redirecting copper exports toward Asia and Europe. In 2023, over 52% of Canadian copper exports had flowed southward across the U.S. border. Severing this pipeline wasn't just a gesture of defiance, it was a seismic shift in North American trade relations. Quebec-based companies like Glencore began rerouting their raw and refined copper toward Japanese and South Korean ports. Financial analysts drew alarming comparisons to the Hoover-era protectionism of the 1930s, when tariffs triggered global trade collapses and prolonged the Great Depression. By replicating that approach in today's interconnected marketplace, the U.S. risks pushing itself into a corner where supply shortages, price inflation, and international alienation form a perfect economic storm. Concrete consequences are already emerging. U.S. manufacturers that depend on copper, from car makers to electronics firms, are facing ballooning material costs, with the United States importing about 810,000 tons of copper in 2024, most of it from a now hostile Canada, as well as Chile, Peru, and Mexico. The prospect of replacing these volumes in the short term is grim. Domestic copper refining facilities, few and underfunded, are ill-equipped to meet growing demand. Major operations like ASARCO in Arizona have even shuttered, overwhelmed by operational costs and insufficient capacity. As U.S. copper becomes significantly more expensive than its global counterparts, up to 25% more by some estimates, a market distortion has emerged. American industries are now caught between buying overpriced domestic copper or waiting for foreign suppliers to navigate new trade barriers and logistical headaches. Meanwhile, foreign copper, unburdened by U.S. tariffs, continues to flow efficiently into Europe and Asia, undercutting American manufacturers and leaving them at a competitive disadvantage. For Trump, the decision to impose such a tariff was framed as a bold assertion of national strength. But in practice, it has exposed the fragility of an industrial base still heavily reliant on international supply chains. The ripple effects extend far beyond boardrooms and factory floors. They reach into the very homes and wallets of everyday Americans. Each EV relies on approximately 80 kilograms of copper. The surge in copper prices has translated into a production cost increase of around $90 per vehicle. Several EV projects have reportedly been delayed or downsized. The cost of a new electric vehicle in the U.S. is climbing by thousands of dollars. Estimates suggest between $3,000 and $6,000 more per car. The construction industry is similarly caught in the storm. Copper is integral to insulation, wiring, and plumbing materials essential to new builds and renovations. As copper prices climb, construction costs soar, adding thousands of dollars to the price of a new home. Estimates suggest increases of $17,000 to $22,000 per house. Utility companies reliant on copper for critical infrastructure face material cost increases of 22 to 25%. A recent report from UBS projects a potential contraction of 0.5 percentage points in U.S. GDP this quarter attributable directly to these supply disruptions. The U.S. has been leaning on existing copper stockpiles purchased before the tariff to cushion the immediate impact. Yet these reserves are finite and rapidly depleting. Once exhausted, companies will face uncompromising price increases, eroding profit margins further and forcing difficult decisions. Canada didn't just respond, it recalibrated. Ottawa announced a CAD $1.8 billion investment plan to build new export infrastructure aimed specifically at scaling shipments to non-American markets. Ports, rail systems, and refinery partnerships in Asia were slated for expansion. That sum was not merely an industrial subsidy, it was a statement. Now those same raw materials are sailing across the Pacific, bypassing American refineries and reshaping copper flows across continents. The strategic dependency the U.S. once counted on, decades of North American integration in raw materials, has fractured. The leverage it once wielded over Canadian exports is gone. The tariffs, designed to rebalance trade, have in fact diminished America's strategic position in one of the most essential supply chains of the 21st century. The question at the core of this unfolding saga is stark. Has the U.S., in its quest for industrial sovereignty, inadvertently severed itself from the global trade networks that once sustained its economic might? The $4.2 billion shock from the copper tariff is more than a monetary figure. It is the opening salvo of a new trade era, one that could see America sidelined in the strategic materials race it once led. For now, the cost is clear, and it is on every American's tab. What happens next will depend on how policymakers balance national security, economic pragmatism, and the realities of an increasingly interdependent world. The copper crisis serves as a potent reminder that in today's